Age at the birth of the first child also declined through the first half of the 20th century as the marriage age declined. The exceptions to this were marriages made during recessions when newlyweds waited longer in general to start a family, or the Great Depression. Around 50% of newlywed couples had their first child in the first year. And by the second year of marriage, the figure has climbed to over 80%. So if you've been married 2 years, there's an 80% probability that you will be a parent. Now, this whole structure is what some scholars have referred to as the creation of heterosexuality. By this is not meant that men and women weren't attracted to each other sexually before the end of the 19th century, but that there's a social structure that developed with sets of expectations for the individuals within that structure about personal autonomy, satisfaction, growth, self-realization, that all of these things could be achieved most fully within a romantic companionate marriage, and the mass media referred to it as heterosexuality. Society created a set of normative expectations which had no reality unless people made active choices over and over again to accept and fulfill the promise implicit in those expectations. And I think oftentimes society can send mixed messages. So one is, wait until you're ready to get married, but the other could be, you can't be a real person until you're married and a parent. And people chose to develop their personal autonomy through plunging into marriage. So Americans responded to this drive by creating their own families in larger numbers at earlier ages. Marriage was not only a source of economic and social security, as it had been in the 19th century, but it was the primary site, it became the primary site for personal satisfaction, which many, though not all historians, believe was a new idea, that the only way you could be happy was to find your life partner, your soulmate. It is more likely in the 19th century that marriage was often viewed as a quid pro quo relationship. The male provided financial and physical security, and the woman provided housekeeping and sexual services. And if I put it in those terms, that's because that's actually how it was often discussed in the 19th century. Part of this, but with this new set of ideas, if marriage did not provide personal satisfaction, then it had no legitimacy. It should be dissolved, and the state ought not to stand in the way of maintaining the sacred state of marriage by preventing unhappy couples from separating and forcing them to continue to live in hypocritical or miserable relationships. Now, if you're a religious conservative, all of this is very bad news. It's very immoral. But for religious liberals, this was in fact consistent with their idea of the message of religion being one of growing personal development. So divorce rates rose throughout the first half of the 20th century, though they also fluctuate wildly. By 1940, the annual divorce rate was about 16%. People were most likely to get divorced in the first year or two, or then around the 10th year. Whether there were children or not does not seem to affect the divorce rate in any significant manner. People who chose to other ways of living on finding personal satisfaction, or subject to innuendo at best and persecution frequently, and often enough incarceration in prison or a mental hospital. Historians who have been looking into this have been arguing that homosexuality or same-sex relationships seem to have been accepted by many Americans in the 19th century as just a part of the range of sexual behavior one might expect to find. It wasn't approved, but as long as it remained, like all other sexual behaviors, confined to private space, it wasn't something that should be of any concern to anybody else. In the 20th century, same-sex desire or homosexuality became a perversion. Psychiatrists stated and religious people agreed that it could only lead to personal unhappiness, and it undermined somehow the stability of family life, and therefore it had to be fought. In the last third of the 19th century, there's evidence that gay and lesbian communities were forming in many cities. That is, as the cities grew, one of the sources of migration into them were people who left the countryside because they did not like living a closeted life. They went to find a place where they could live more openly and more safely. And this was noted, this is part of the criminalization of same-sex behavior begins when the cities start passing laws in the 1890s to regulate public displays of same-sex attraction. Laws were passed against cross-dressing with the intent to deceive about one's actual gender. But in Chicago, where such a law was passed in 1895, the booking pictures of men wearing women's clothes by and large show fellows with the mustaches, 3 days stubble on their face. There's no wearing women's clothing, but there's nobody who would be confused about what kind of plumbing they had. So did the law actually mean what it said? Laws against cruising were passed in the 1910s as part of campaigns to criminalize vice. At the same time, there were major campaigns to close down brothels, houses of prostitution, which had largely been legal or allowed to exist. Now, studies of how such laws were enforced show really marked class biases at play, as well as fear of strangers. In Sacramento, for example, one of the places where this has been studied in depth, there were police campaigns starting in 1912 to ensnare men in parks with police decoys soliciting sex. The campaign was controversial. It was criticized in the Sacramento newspapers as a violation of privacy rights that most citizens had. And perhaps there's also the reluctance to publicize sexual behavior that was considered deviant. If the man arrested was from Sacramento, jurors overwhelmingly acquitted the individual. And then eventually, by 1913, the DA's office stopped pressing charges against men arrested who were residents of the city of Sacramento. However, Sacramento was also a center for migrant laborers, a place where men, primarily men, stopped over during the cold winter months when work in the fields, mines, and timber fields was scarce. And thus, fear of homosexuality got mingled with fear of radicals, union activity, anarchy, as well as fear of hobos, who had long been viewed as a perpetual source of crime and disease. And so migrant workers who were caught up in the police campaigns against cruising had very high conviction rates, well over 80%, and typically they were sentenced to 10 years in prison for the first offense. In this sense, the campaigns against homosexuality were also marked were clearly marked by some issues about class and maintaining middle class dominance over society. The campaigns against brothels, against same-sex activity, were all part of a larger campaign after the 1900 that was growing in order to purify society of vice. And the apex of that campaign was prohibition. For Americans in 1920, the single most important act was the ratification of prohibition, which made it impossible to buy or sell alcohol. It was the result of an 80-year campaign, and it's generally misunderstood today because it's so foreign to the way we think, and most current historical literature ignores or passes over the topic, and it's subject to stereotypes continuously repeated, gangsters and lawlessness, and it was a great failure that didn't do any good. Now, in that it was repealed, it was obviously a failure. It failed to freeze American life and politics as its advocates had believed. It failed to reunite and cleanse American society so the United States could live up to some sort of abstract democratic ideal. Prohibition was a very complex issue in which religious ideas mingle with ideas for political reform, to come up with a program which its advocates said was absolutely necessary to reform U.S. society and would, in fact, reform U.S. society. Now, the question remains, why would so many people believe that combating alcohol was the magic formula for ending corruption in public life and in private life? So we can look at this from several different perspectives. The first is that in the 19th century, the federal government's two major sources of income had been customs duties, that is, tariffs, and liquor taxes. And liquor taxes provided more than half of the income that the federal government used to pay its employees for pretty much everything. This meant, from the point of view of religious people, that the government profited from the misery of the people. That it had to encourage people to drown their sorrows in alcohol. So to reform the government required weaning the government from its reliance on alcohol, which was simultaneously a reliance on misery and sin. So the Tariff Act of 1913 and the income tax were